Hello, everybody. This is David Lafferty. I'm here on this episode of the Critical Catholic by myself. Mike Lewis is off this week. Just wanted to mention that Mike Lewis can't be with us this evening because he had a tragedy in his family. His beloved older sister passed away this week from a congenital health problem. So I'll ask you to please pray for the repose of her soul and for the whole Lewis family. But I'm here alone, but I'm with a guest that I'm really excited to speak with, and this is Dr. Brett Salkeld. He is a theologian for the Archdiocese of Regina, Saskatchewan, and he's also appears regularly on the Thinking Faith podcast. He writes for Church Life Journal on a fairly regular basis, and he has a book out right now on transubstantiation. And that's something that you can find. I checked it out. You can find it on Amazon. So have a look for that if you're interested. And he's also told me he's working on a new book for Catholic teachers. So welcome, Brett.
Hi, good to be here.
Excellent. Thanks. Mike and I were talking about you. He had pointed out that, you're writing this really interesting stuff on conspiracy theory. And he said, this would be a great guy to have on the podcast. And when I looked at your work, I fully agreed. And I thought, yeah, though, this is absolutely perfect. This is what we're all about on the Critical Catholic. So just before we get into our conversation, I'd like to just offer a quick prayer that we usually say at the beginning of our show, just to help get us in the zone. So in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, Amen.
Amen.
Heavenly Father, please guide us in our discussion, help us to dispel confusion, discern fact from fiction, and cleave to the truth. Allow us to contribute to the creation of a healthy Catholic media culture. Amen.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so, I got to say, it's wonderful to be talking to a fellow Canadian. There aren't that many Canadians on where Peter is, so this is pretty cool. We're taking over. So I'm in Ottawa, Ontario, and you're in Regina. How are things going in Regina?
Pretty good. Rainy. We're farm country, and it's the farmers just got the seed in the ground, most of it, and the skies opened up. So we're pretty grateful out here this weekend, and missed a bunch of baseball practices, but that rain's probably worth billions of dollars in the granary by the end of the year. So we'll skip baseball for the weekend.
Yeah, it's worth it for sure. And that's great that you're getting back to things like baseball. Right now in Ontario, we're in the midst of a lockdown still. We had a bit of a setback. Things got a little out of control, and we're still trying to get the vaccines rolled out to everybody. So, and it's coming along though. And it's,
things are picking up. I think my boys who are 12 and 14 are eligible now, so we can take them down to the pharmacy just down the street later this week.
Wonderful. That's great. Yeah, I got vaccinated recently, and it feels good to have a little protection, a little more confidence going out and about, and I think I'm feeling that confidence in people outside now, and it just feels like the thaw is coming, and things are things are getting back to normal. So I guess I'd like to start off by asking you how you became interested in conspiracy theory. And I should mention that this show, the Critical Catholic, that's one of the reasons that we started this show, is because we were dealing with so much misinformation and conspiracy theory kind of seeping into the Catholic world and Catholic certain areas of Catholic media. And we felt that it was good to have a regular show that would look at some of the problems that it raises and maybe try to help do something about it. Mm-hmm. So maybe if you could you just give us an overview of how you became interested in this phenomenon of conspiracy theory?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've always been interested, but it became a sort of professional interest for me around the time of the Amazon Synod. So I work in a diocesan office, and I try to stay up on my reading, what's going on in the global church, and following the coverage and the reactions to the various proposals, or the imagined proposals, or the ostensible proposals, or whatever, of the Amazon Synod. It felt like there was a shift happening. I mean, ever since Pope Francis was elected, there have been Catholic media outlets that have taken a certain stance that maybe goes beyond normal journalistic license in terms of interpretation. Some ill will in interpretation, right? And just an unwillingness to try to report what is true, but coming with a very specific agenda. But with the Amazon Synod, it seemed to sort of go into sort of this hyper phase. So I actually said to my bishop, who's my boss, I said, I think the bishops need to start thinking about this, because it's becoming a real problem. And maybe you might propose to your fellow bishops, that when next time you have a plenary assembly, they bring in speakers and different things. You might, look for someone who could address this topic. And he said, well, why don't you become an expert in it? And I said, well, you're the boss, I guess. So I went from reading various things on the internet, not so much about conspiracy theories, but conspiracy theory style things, right? I was reading those kinds of things and picking them apart, and then some of the reactions to them. I went from that to like getting a bunch of books, like academic books by psychologists and social theorists and whatever, to learn about what really is a conspiracy, and how does it work, and how does it impact people. And so I just started reading, and as I started reading, I was able to see a lot of things much more clearly, right? Because the thing about conspiracy theories is they're slippery. Like, they're designed to be tough to get a handle on, and we don't have a lot of good categories for them. They've been designed to subvert our best categories for understanding information. And so I found that I had categories for parsing what I was reading, and that was really helpful. And so then I started engaging in different particular questions, and I wrote a couple pieces. And when people read them, I got a lot of responses that were like, yes, that's exactly what it feels like when I read a conspiracy theory. You've sort of helped me see and understand and the thing about conspiracy theories is a lot of people, when they see them, they know something's fishy. Even conspiracy theorists themselves know, because they'll post on my Facebook, they'll say, well, is this a conspiracy theory? And 100% yes. Every time they do that, it is, because they recognize what other people think is funny business, right? And so it's been helpful to have categories to think about it and help other people think about it. It's also a little scary to watch the information environment sort of morph. Because this is cultural, but this is also technological, right? So the way that information spreads on social media is different than it has spread. Not completely different, but there's new things happening in the way information is spread and shared that have really complicated the situation and given conspiracy theory thinking a real boost. And then throw in something like a pandemic, and you've got a perfect storm, because historically speaking, conspiracy theories always thrive in times of uncertainty, right? When people are trying to make sense of their world. So between the technological changes in communications and things like the pandemic, it's really gotten crazy out there.
I agree. I think the Amazon Synod, that, like you pointed out, was a real turning point where this stuff got really, really crazy. And I found it so frustrating when, people would see stuff on that was occurring at the synod, and Vatican News would actually usually write a very nice contextualized piece about everything that had happened, but that would always come out like a day later or something. But there were all these other outlets that could just produce stuff almost like minutes later in some cases, right?
I actually think a lot of things were written beforehand.
Yeah.
I mean, I think because you already know what LifeSite News is going to say 3 days before it happens. There's no guesswork involved in what they're going to say about a given thing. So they can basically write things in advance, tweak for a couple of sort of details, and have it ready to go. I mean, one of the things about conspiracy theories is a kind of weird, shocking predictability. Like you know what their answer to a given problem or situation is going to be. They sort of telegraph it. So I do think that there was a lot of, but this goes to the communications technology, right? You get out of the gate first, you get the hits. And it's much harder to get the horses back in the barn than to let them out in the first place. And the environment drove this need for hits and interactions and whatever, which are how these groups monetize their platforms. And so I think there was a real incentive to just be like, let's get something out. We can write the same basic story 15 times in a row.
Yeah, there's a real repetition to a lot of it. It's the same themes over and over again.
Over and over. Yeah.
And I when just before, I think it was just before anyway, the Amazon Synod happened, or as it was happening, a website appeared called Pan Amazon Synod Watch, which was run by a group associated with the Tradition Family Property Movement. And they were laying out they had all these articles, and you could tell that a lot of the stuff that ended up being kind of coming into Catholic media on social media was being taken from this source material, or at least that source material had sort of planted the seed for a lot of things that then spread on social media. So there was some real organization to a lot of it.
It's a very strange thing because the narrative is, look out, here's what the liberals are going to try to make the synod about. And then, and it's women deacons and it's ordained priests, right? And it was the very conservative outlets that managed to keep those issues at the forefront. And then when you read Caridia Amazonia, it gets like a little treatment in the 4th chapter on those questions. And it was far from the central focus of the thing. But I mean, it's both sides almost collude to undermine the church's ability to have a healthy discussion about the central issues, because everyone's media, whether you're liberal or conservative, everybody's media numbers are driven by the controversial issues. And it was laid out by media before the thing started that this is what we're going to all talk about for the next few weeks.
Yeah, to be fair, it was not just the kind of far right Catholic media that was doing this. It was there was also a lot of hype generated by liberal Catholic media, or just the liberal media in general, about the potential implications for changes to Catholic discipline and things like that that could come through this synod. So there is some blame to go around, and in the end, like you said, it seemed like a lot of people didn't really experience the synod. They experienced all the conspiracy stuff around it, but they missed the whole point of it in some ways, like the really substantial issues that were discussed. So it's a tragic thing that we're not sometimes actually seeing what's going on in the church. We're just seeing a sort of parody of it, right?
Yeah. It's really a circus, and both these groups feed each other. I mean, they butter their bread by spending their time on each other. And I think it's worth recognizing that they've cultivated an economic plan that requires that kind of rivalry, right? If they were to step off and say, we're not going to give this any air because that will subvert the workings of the church and the church's ability to have healthy discussion, they'd be cutting into their own profits. I mean, or even if they're nonprofit, cutting into their own revenues, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the outrage bait that drives the clicks all the time, and it's a very difficult thing to fight against. So you published just recently a piece on the Word on Fire blog, which I really enjoyed. I thought it was very insightful, called "Faith, Reason, and Conspiracy Theories," and I've put the link in the chat, and for anyone who wants to check it out. But in this piece, and I mentioned this earlier, you're taking a bit of a different approach than I might take, in that you're coming at this from like a theological, philosophical perspective, which I find really interesting and refreshing. And you start by looking at the relationship, or conspiracy theory, but by looking at the relationship between truth and faith. And I wonder if you could expand on the position you outline here on the relationship between truth and faith, and how conspiracy theory subverts this, or this model.
Yeah, I mean, a Catholic epistemology says you don't know anything without faith. It's not only the truths of our Catholic faith. It's not only things, that are revealed, right? It's not only divine revelation that we know by faith, but even something like science requires trust in certain basic commitments, right? That my mind has real access to true knowledge about reality, or that my senses are reliable, or that my reason is reliable. So all of our knowing, all of our access to truth is follows upon an act of trust. You can't get to truth without trust. And often, like very, very often, that's trust in some authority, right? Whether it's a medical authority or a scientific authority or whatever. I mean, you don't check that the milk is not poisoned every time you go to the grocery store. I mean, there's basic trust that makes you able to operate in the world. But then when trust breaks down, you don't actually get to go to a point where you say, well, I'm just going to be a critical consumer of everything who checks everything for myself. Anyone who tells themselves that that's what they're doing has simply blinded themselves to the fact that now they're trusting something else. And I think what typically happens with the conspiracy theory thinking is, okay, there's reasons to be critical in our engagement with mainstream media. I mean, who would deny it, right? I mean, they get things wrong. They should be checked. They have particular issues where they're almost always biased, right? And I mean, if you're a pro-life Catholic and you've been watching mainstream media deal with abortion or euthanasia for 30 years, you can't trust them to deal well and fairly on those topics, right? So yeah, you should have your critical lenses on when you engage here. What happens with the conspiracy theorist is that criticism, or that critical engagement with mainstream sources, gets to the point where it's just an automatic rejection. But then what they don't notice happens is other sources, any source that rejects a mainstream interpretation, gets a kind of free pass and doesn't get the critical engagement. So people will share memes of things that are demonstrably false. All you have to do is just look it up. But they'll share them without double checking them because they run counter to the mainstream idea. And so what you get is this mindset where you think you're the most critical consumer of information because you question the mainstream media, but you don't question alternative views at all. You give them a free pass. In fact, you're happy to accept them if they're mutually contradictory sometimes. Because the real goal becomes not so much finding out what's true, but casting doubt on a given narrative. So there's always this there's this negative, right? As long as it's not the mainstream view. I mean, what's wrong with the COVID vaccines? Is it that they're microchipped, or is it that they are covert gene therapy, or is it that they're going to cause infertility? Or it doesn't matter which one it is, as long as there's something wrong with them. And you do this scattershot methodology where you list 20 things that are wrong, and then if your interlocutor can disprove 20 or 30 or 50 or 80% of them, you still feel like your position stands because you can always find just one more. So it's this strange trust in anything that's against the thing you mistrust, instead of actually a careful sifting of evidence, of sources, engaging with materials in a responsible way. So it parades as critical thinking, but it actually, in its excess, can't sort of see its own sort of rear guard, and gets taken over by this other form of irrational thinking.
Yeah, and I think this is probably how very intelligent people can be drawn into conspiratorial thinking, because, like you said, there are good reasons to mistrust the mainstream media. There's good reasons to question the motives of politicians or world leaders of various kinds. And so, it's good to cultivate, and I would tell anyone that they should cultivate a critical attitude, like a healthily critical attitude. But like you said, when the trust sort of completely evaporates, then you start to you fall into this world where, anything that is outside the mainstream media is trustworthy. Anything that comes from the mainstream media is necessarily part of this grand illusion. And I mean, I've seen people there's a woman, Naomi Wolf, who in the 90s, I think it was, wrote a book called The Beauty Myth, which is this huge best-selling book. And she's, considered a reasonably mainstream sort of feminist thinker and critical thinker. And recently it seems the last year or so, fallen into this COVID conspiracy stuff. And the last thing I know, she was talking on Steve Bannon's podcast. And I was thinking, what insane world are we living in, where Naomi Wolf is chatting with Steve Bannon about things they share in common and believe. It's so bizarre, but yeah, it's because this conspiracy theory united them, and it seems that even people who have the ability to think critically and think intelligently about things can fall into this. I mean, I'll admit there have been times in my life when I've sort of given too much credence to particular conspiracy theories. Usually I can pull out of it after a while, but for a little time I'm like, oh, I'm kind of red pilled about this. And, and then eventually you come to your senses, but some people, they don't come to their senses. Well, they stay there.
It's tricky because there are real conspiracies. I mean, there's kind of a linguistic problem because conspiracy theorists will just say, well, I mean, look at big tobacco, look at, what's the name of the Tuskegee
experiment? Yeah.
Right. Look at Watergate. I mean, there's actual conspiracies in the world, and so it gets confusing. We need to be able to articulate that there is a style of thinking that doesn't work. It doesn't discover truth. It doesn't get you from here to truth. That we call conspiratorial thinking. But people hear and say, well, that's awfully naive. You think that nobody in the world has an alternate agenda? And of course there's people in the world with alternate agendas all over. I mean, if I say that a given Catholic media outlet has been pushed towards conspiratorial thinking because their profits derive from the hits and interactions that this kind of material generates, well, I've just articulated a conspiracy. Right? I mean, so all of a sudden, any explanation that involves anything like that it becomes counter evidence. And so what I want to be able to say is there's a style of thinking that is inadequate, right? And it's in a way it's fundamentally. I don't mean to say that every person who does it is dishonest, but there's a dishonesty at the heart of it because it's not actually willing to go where the evidence goes. It's generally a conclusion in search of evidence or a conclusion in search of an argument, right? So if you're anti-vax, then it's funny, you watch how, if I'm LifeSite News, the question should largely be about the relation between the vaccines and abortion. And if you pay attention to the coverage, that's hardly mentioned anymore. right? It didn't grab. It was easily resolvable within basic principles of Catholic moral theology. If Francis had got the vaccine and Benedict had not, they might have made hay with that. But both popes getting the vaccine together undercut that narrative, and so now it's all about. They say it's not really a vaccine. They say it's gene therapy. They say it's going to have all these problems down the road, that we're all part of some mass experiment. It's all part of some global reset. It's not about abortion anymore. And so it's like, okay, well, the abortion thing didn't work to undermine the vaccine, so we better find something else. And you just keep chasing an argument for a conclusion that you've had from the beginning, which is, I don't want this vaccine. And there's something fundamentally dishonest about like having your conclusion and then searching all over for your argument. And I find that all the time with this kind of stuff. Oh, you're muted, David.
Apologies. Sorry. That's a really good point. In that, there are valid questions people could have about the vaccines. Like you said, the idea of this connection to stem cell lines that were originally derived from a aborted fetus, that is relevant, and it's a real thing that anyone in the church who's thinking rigorously in terms of more Catholic morals has to take into consideration, and it was taken into consideration. The CDF talked about it, and it's pretty clear how that plays out. But yeah, like you said, that wasn't enough, because the idea that this is all this great reset, this is all part of a new world order that is trying to control the population of the world, that came first, I think, in a lot of cases, and then they find evidence that can that seems to support their conclusion. But you have to have that basic trust that even though there are people with agendas out there, absolutely, that in general you can trust the scientific community, you can trust the global political community within limits. I mean, there's always limits, right? Like, but you have to have like just some basic, understanding that not everyone is out to enslave us, or not everyone is out to, and also that people are just not that organized. Even if they wanted to, it would be incredibly difficult to do. Yeah,
there's a few things. One is a lot of the things about conspiracy theories are just implausible in terms of organization, right? So I've recently been involved in a small political effort on a local municipal bill. The other side imagines that we've got like international backing, and we're all and people on our side say the same thing about the other side, and it's remarkable when I talk to someone on the other side how like low budge everything is and how disorganized everything is, and like it's really, and so we sort of imagine those kinds of things much too easily. We also, you see this really weird dynamic among conspiratorial thinking, which is you trust certain mainstream sources when you want to. So very often you'll see this, even the CDC says, even Fauci says, even this article in the Lancet says. Wait a minute, do we trust articles in the Lancet or not? Do we, like, it's this strange, there's a very selective use of evidence. And that's one of the things that happens with this kind of thinking is you selectively grab at evidence that supports, and you twist it to make it support, and then you ignore other things. So there's always something else driving the bus that's not the search for truth, right? Like I saw a guy post on my Facebook the other day, your chances of dying from COVID. Well, the way he had done the calculation was very just subtly deceiving if you're not paying attention. He just took the number of deaths in Saskatchewan divided by the number of people at a certain date and said, well, that's like way less than 1% chance, right? Well, that looks plausible, except that's okay. There's 20 problems with it from a statistical point of view. That's at a certain date. That's if no one ever gets it again, right? but actually you don't calculate it against the population. You calculate it against people who contracted it, right? It's like, what are your chances of dying if you get it? And then then another calculation is, what are your chances of getting it? It's not just like, 3 months into a pandemic, X number of people have died out of a population of Y, and but it looks really compelling. Like someone just did a math equation on Facebook that says that virtually no one dies from this. And then you end up with this, like 3.5 million people are dead, but somehow it's virtually zero though. 3.5 million somehow becomes virtually zero. Someone else posted that this number has probably changed now because this is a few weeks ago. 75 or 80 people in the United States had died after being fully vaccinated, had died of COVID after being fully vaccinated. Well, that was at the time, there were 75 to 80 million fully vaccinated people. So that means your odds were 1 in a million. So when they say your odds of surviving are great, they give this tiny, tiny percentage of deaths. But when they say people die after being vaccinated, they give you a raw number that's 75 or 80 people died. Now that looks like a huge number, but 3.5 million people dead looks like a tiny number. It's just this insane,
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have like a stronger understanding of statistics and how these things actually play out, it can be so easy to be misled. And I don't have a very strong understanding of statistics, so I have to be careful with that kind of stuff. But those are the kind of things that often get me sometimes. I'm like, oh, wait a second. But then I have to actually dig for some context.
Yeah.
The one thing I wanted to bring up, you cite a book in your paper by Nancy Rosenblum and Russell Moorhead. It's called A Lot of People Are Saying, The New Conspiracism and the Assault on Democracy. I haven't read this book, but I've seen it come up a lot. And one thing that I liked about it was that you mentioned was they said that, these days with this sort of new conspiracism, one mark of it in some ways is that there's the theory part is missing from conspiracy theory. Now, instead, you get more like an avalanche of misinformation that seeks to undermine any kind of possibility of truth, just so that people can push a particular narrative. And you connect this idea to Friedrich Nietzsche. And I think that's fascinating. Just for people who don't know Nietzsche, he's the 19th century philosopher who really altered thinking on values and came up with ideas like the will to power and the Superman. But could you expand a little on how this new type of conspiracy theory relates to Nietzsche as you see it? Right.
So what the authors of that book point out is that in our contemporary information environment, conspiracy theories don't need to theorize very much. They can just posit. They can just assert, just put out a tweet, and all of a sudden this idea is credible. Now, what do you mean by credible? To people who are looking for something to believe that aligns with their, preconceived notions on a given issue, you just tweet it, and you don't need to give much backing. You just say something. And in particular, they look at Trump's record on Twitter. Not only sometimes things he produced himself, but also things he retweets, right? So someone just says anything, and Trump retweets it, and now it's a thing. And you don't need to double check if it's true or if it's how it relates to the facts. All you need to check is, does it comport with your worldview? And if so, then you believe it. And so conspiracism has gone from conspiracy theorizing to conspiracy asserting. And I thought it was related to Nietzsche's sort of sense that external limits need to go, right? Like there's nothing beyond me to say what's good and true. I'm a self-made person. I decide what's right for me. I decide what's true for me. I act the way I want to act, regardless of cultural or societal restrictions. And so the fundamental category is not truth, but it's power, right? And if you can just assert something, some conspiracy, without even making a pretense of making an argument for it, right? Of some pretense of connection to truth. You just say, this is how it is. That looks to me like now the fundamental bar that we're measuring is not truth that outside of us, it's power. And whoever has the power can say what they want to say. And they can leverage the media environment to say it if they want to.
Yeah, and that really fits with Nietzsche's idea of the Superman as someone who makes his own truth. In a world where there are no like absolute values, what you do is you create your own out of whatever you can find, essentially. And I saw that in the whole Stop the Steal thing that evolved after it became clear that Trump had lost the election. I saw all these, little bits popping up here and there, some things that Trump was retweeting that were coming from classic conspiracy theory sources, like sometimes QAnon people and that sort of thing. And over time, I thought, these are all false. And I looked into some of these, I dug into them. A lot of people dug into them. They were all false. But over time, they created a sort of pseudo-truth, which was this idea that there was widespread election fraud, and it's a truth that Trump essentially constructed, and it's a truth that the Republican Party seems to be finding it very difficult to let go of. So it's such a fascinating, disturbing thing. But I find it interesting how it does have its roots in this very modern sort of way of thinking, this that derives from Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche really helped to define some of the paths that philosophy took during the 20th century, and especially this sort of create your own truth mentality.
And one of the fundamental things about conspiracy theories is they're really designed to sow doubt. They're not really designed to build a case. They're designed to sow doubt against another thing. And so if some of their case building falls apart, they can just fall back on, but I still have no reason to trust this other thing, right? And the end game of that kind of doubt sowing is in the end a sort of total cynicism, right? And that's what leads. Well, then there's nothing left but the assertion of power. And it's remarkable to watch Catholics who up until like 3 years ago were, full on Pope Benedict, dictatorship of relativism. Relativism is terrible. And now those same people on my Facebook will say, how can we even know what's true anymore? They make these sort of bold claims and that's their response. If they make some claim that you can disprove, then the fallback is, well, who even knows what's true? These were people who hated relativism up until 3 years ago. And
that's something that, on the Critical Catholic, we've tried to, put forward, is that you can't, as a Catholic, morally speaking, you can't use lies or misinformation to achieve a goal, no matter what the goal is. Even if it's a noble goal, if you're harnessing lies and fooling people and trying to create your own truth, or the sort of thing, that's an illegitimate path to take. So
I will take the ring and march into battle and defeat Sauron. No, throw in the fire. That's evil. If you win with that, you become Sauron.
That's a very good analogy. I think I had never thought of that, but that's actually a very, very good analogy. The ring. Yes, it's very tricky, very tricky.
Yeah, that's why Gandalf won't touch the thing.
Yeah, because he knows that's its power, right?
Yeah.
And he's susceptible to it, I'm sure, just like anyone else. We all are. We're all susceptible to that way of thinking. I'd like to move on to another paper that you published recently, and this one was in the Church Life Journal, on Catholic creationism as a conspiracy theory. And this is fascinating. I wrote a little bit a year or so ago on Catholic creationism, because I came across, I think, the same people that you came across, the Colby Center. And I was a little shocked that there were Catholics who took this fundamentalist approach to creation or creationism, but at the time I wasn't thinking of it in terms of a conspiracy theory, and I think this frames it in a really interesting way. So maybe could you just tell us a little bit about how this essay came about?
Right. So I wrote a piece like 6-7 years ago, just for our Archdiocesan blog, explaining a basic Catholic approach to evolution. Right. It's not a problem given the way that Catholics read Scripture, given our doctrine of creation, given the magisterium's basic approach to this question, given, I quoted Augustine and Aquinas on these questions, said, it's not a problem for Catholics. Evolution isn't a problem for Catholics. Now, an internet sort of self-appointed internet, orthodoxy watchdog came across this years later and went after me. So it was in response to his sort of, so he went after me. I wrote a bit of a response. Then he got this group to, I thought it was over, but he wrote me this massive document going after me, and I read it, and it was just, as I was reading it, this is after I started, my bishop asked me to develop some expertise in conspiracy theories. So now I had these categories. I started reading it, and I was like, wow, like this is, so I don't mean to say that any person who has ever believed in some version of creationism is automatically a conspiracy theorist. Because I don't mean that the content is a conspiracy theory. I mean that the way that these people were engaging was conspiratorial. And it was things like, once you demonstrate that a certain claim is false or doesn't prove what you think it claims, you just move on. Like you just ignore it. You pretend it didn't even happen. So it was just chock full of these sort of bogus claims. And so I wrote this piece for Church Life Journal as kind of as a response, but I didn't want to do a direct response to them because that felt to me like quicksand. So what I wanted to do instead was to write something to help Catholics in general understand what's going on when they encounter this kind of thinking. And I think it was very successful in that regard. Like I've got a lot of feedback from people who said, like I always thought something was funny, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And you've just described my experience. I even, a science teacher told me that someone in his family sort of reconsidered their creationism based on it, because there was something in there that now I see how there's a kind of dishonest form of argumentation going on here. So I didn't focus on the scientific claims, which is what they would want me to do. I focused on the form of argumentation, which is largely illegitimate. Of course, they wrote a lengthy response to me again, and I just said, well, carry on. I mean, if you want to write 50,000 words every time I open my mouth, they might write another one now. I don't know. I mean, there's only so much time in the world,
Well, I think it's important the distinction you made between, those who maybe, let's say, don't believe in evolution, right? Who are Catholics, we're not required to believe in evolution as Catholics, right? But there's nothing stopping us from, right, accepting evolution. And like you mentioned in your piece, there's recent popes have certainly talked about evolution like it's just simply an established.
They just take it for granted.
It for granted, yeah. But there's something very different about this type of creationism. A lot of people tend to associate this type of creationism with fundamentalist Protestantism. What are the differences between fundamentalist Protestantism, which is I would say is more common, at least in the United States, maybe,
right,
and this kind of Catholic creationism?
Yeah, so they'll overlap and use each other's resources on the scientific questions. But the Catholic creationist actually has to deal with the problem that the magisterium doesn't seem to have a problem with evolution, right? So there's this whole extra layer of like, how do I deal with the fact that the popes talk about it like it's sort of taken for granted scientific fact, that the overwhelming majority of the theological guild has no problem with it. I mean, even in in the court cases in the United States, that, you know, about teaching intelligent design or creationism in schools, Catholic experts and Catholic dioceses and whatever show up on the witness stands in favor of evolution. I mean, this is awkward for the Catholic creationist, right? And so they end up in having to do a lot of work with some very meager resources that they find in the tradition. They take one line from the Council of Trent, which is not even about this, and they try to make it fit, and they try to make hay out of it. And then they take some pronouncements from the Pontifical Biblical Commission from the early 20th century, which are a little, I mean, they're more closely related than the Tridentine passage they grasp after. But they try to make this work, but they have to make these things like super authoritative and more authoritative than everything else that the church has said and done on these topics. And they really have to stretch them to say things they never say. And so that's some of the work I did in that piece, is to just like, I did a deep dive into walking through some of those passages in church teaching, what the historical context was, what it actually says, how this applies to the question, how this relates to other things in church teaching. I mean, the Tridentine text in question is then interpreted. I mean, later popes refer to it and tell us how they interpret it, you know, like Leo the 13th. So, I mean, I did that kind of deep work, but the Catholic creationist has to like really paddle upstream against their own tradition, which means that they're basically suspicious of like anything coming out of Rome for like the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years, right, is all suspect. And then it gets lumped in with everything, right? So the document they sent me, they're against ecumenism. We need to talk more about fathers as heads of households. You know, this is about degenerate liturgy, like everything is connected with evolution. It's really something to behold. But conspiracy theories can become that way. Like QAnon does it too, right? They can become all encompassing. They explain everything. They're the lens for understanding everything that's going on in the world. I think that's happening to some degree with people about vaccines and stuff now. It's every single political or even, I mean, even the weather. Like there's people who think it's the end of the world and this is the mark of the beast. And then when the rivers were running red in Russia because of the mining runoff or whatever, it was literally the end of the world, you know. They can become this all-encompassing thing.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about the end of the world the last, while. But if you look at the history of, all the people who have ever claimed it was the end of the world, it's fascinating, and it always leads to that great disappointment when it actually doesn't end.
Saskatchewan, he's been pumping the end of the world for 20, 30 years now, and all his followers and all his people who send him money, they're convinced that this time he's right. Well, we went to World Meeting of Families in Philadelphia, I think it was in 2015, and we were told not to go because Mark Mallet had said the world is going to end starting with a catastrophe in Philadelphia during the World Meeting of Families. Well, of course it didn't happen, but that doesn't stop anyone from thinking that he's right this time. It's funny to me how he maintains the trust of his audience when he's batting like 0 for. He's 0 for infinity, And
it's the same with QAnon as well. There's always these predictions about, all the arrests are going to happen, all the Democrat politicians are going to be sent to Guantanamo Bay or executed, and it's always going to happen like next Wednesday, and then it doesn't happen. But they just keep going on, and I mean, even now, after like nothing has come true, there's still a much smaller now, but very devoted band of QAnon people out there still. One thing that some of the evidence that I guess magisterial evidence that these Catholic creationists bring to the table is this, and you quoted it here. It's the 1909 response of the Pontifical Biblical Commission on Genesis, and I found this interesting because there they talk about how I think the quote was something about how the Genesis should be read literally or something along those lines, right? But as you pointed out, this has to be read in context of what was going on at the time. And you said that, this was the time of the modernist controversy, right? So, and there was this huge movement that was part of modernism that was about a really radically skeptical approach to biblical studies. And, this is more of a response to that sort of extreme skepticism, rather than a sort of healthy criticism or maybe non-literal understanding of the Bible. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Well, so yeah, I think even if certain claims that the Biblical Commission made at the time, right? So Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch is a big one, right? Or Matthean priority, right? That Matthew was written before Mark. Now, almost the vast majority of biblical scholars today think Mark was written before Matthew. Well, how much does that matter for the life of faith? Which one was written first? But some people think it's a huge deal because they think the church has taught definitively that Matthew came first. But the bigger question at the time was that what we call historical critical method was threatening to undermine the scripture as the word of God, period. It was just going to make it into one more historical document with no bearing on the life of faith. And that's what the church was pushing back against. And so Pope Benedict, or Joseph Ratzinger, said on the 100th anniversary of the Pontifical Biblical Commission that they overshot the mark, and they actually, what I can't remember the exact term, but injured the credibility of the church by overshooting the mark, right? And on this particular question, there's one clause. There's like 8 questions, and on the second one is the strongest one, where it says like there has to be some sort of historical core to what's going on in the Genesis narratives. But then they conveniently ignore that, like several questions down, the document itself says like you don't have to interpret 6 days as 6 literal days. It could be figurative, And like if the strictest document you can find in the history of the Vatican says that you don't need to interpret 6 days as 6 literal days, then you're pushing real hard on that one question to do all the heavy lifting for you. When in other parts of the same document, in the same context where they're responding to modernism, won't even carry your water for you. So they have to do this very selective kind of reading to make it work. And it's when you start, if all you see is the quote, and this is how these things work in general, if all you see is the quote, you're like, oh, maybe there is something here. And then you find out all the things they left out, and you're like, okay, wait a minute. Someone's trying to manipulate me, right? And it's the same move as these statistics. When someone's like, 70 people died, and then someone else is like, you realize that means 1 in a million. Oh, I guess I'm being manipulated, right?
And if you go down that road with church teaching the way that they seem to, it can become absurd after a while. Like I know that there are, and this is a different group of people, but I know there are Catholic geocentrists out there. So the people who believe that the Earth is the center of our galaxy, and that everything revolves around the Earth, and basically because the church took that for granted until after the time of Galileo, that it must be true. So you have to. And they'll use scientific methods, pseudo methods, to try to prove this. And yeah, you can just go back further and further if you're not taking into consideration the fact that the church does learn things over time. We do, like
right.
And it's the popes who are often the ones who develop things in this way and develop our understanding of the world and reinterpret church teaching in a new way with a new interpretation that's more in line with what we know now. So, but if you miss that subtlety and you just go, you're just focused on these little quotes and these little
right.
Things that you think are just absolute, that you get sucked into that.
The geocentrism is fascinating. So what a lot of people don't realize, they may have heard of Dr. Pamela Acker, who's written this Catholic guide to vaccines, right? And they think, oh, a Catholic doctor wrote a guide to vaccines. Great. Well, she couldn't get published by any reputable Catholic or scientific publisher. So she was published by the Kolbe Institute. Well, the Kolbe Institute also publishes Geocentrism.
Okay, so they do that. Okay, they do.
You're getting your vaccine information from a publisher that says that the Earth is at the center of the universe. Yeah. And I mean, here's my favorite story about this. This is mind-boggling. There was a very traditionalist priest from the Fraternal Society of St. Peter, right? So Latin Mass group. He wrote. He had some training in science. He wrote a book about creation, and he accepted the evidence for an old Earth or old universe. And he had never heard of this group, the Kolbe Institute, but they went after him. And so then he did a little research after they went after him, and he looked at the work of St. Maximilian Kolbe, who they took their name from, and found out that Maximilian Kolbe himself believed in an old universe and thought the scientific evidence for that was compelling. So he wrote to the Kolbe Institute and said, have a little integrity, either change your name, right, or stop teaching this stuff that's contrary to what St. Maximilian taught. And their response is so telling. I mean, it's really beautiful in a way in how it encapsulates the worldview. They said, no, we will keep him as our patron because now in heaven, St. Maximilian recognizes his error and will be working overtime to counteract the harm he did on earth by teaching this. And so he's actually the perfect patron for us because we're helping him sort of cover his tracks here and undo the damage he did by teaching that kind of falseness. Now, if you can find an example of a worldview that's more self-insulated than that, I'll eat a hat of your choosing. I mean, like, it's remarkable. That's
incredible self-deception on their part, or self-justification and rationalization. Is just unbelievable. So on that note, because we're at the end of our time here, I just thought I'd ask one more question, and I wanted to ask you, do you think there's any way to pull people out of this once they've gone into it? And if you do think it's possible, are there any tips that you have?
Yeah. So I think there's some really important distinctions, which is there are hardcore conspiracy theorists, and then there's a lot of people who are like, I wonder about that. And there's a lot of good work that can be done with people who are tempted but not fully committed. I think the work that's been done on vaccines in the last 5 months there's been some incredible work that's got a lot of people who heard misinformation, got them good information so that they can make a better decision for them and their family and their society. So I think there is a lot of room, even on things like this steal the election thing. I knew people who were who wondered, they thought maybe this was plausible. And then they, as they engaged, honestly, the dominoes started to fall. So I think the work is worth doing, if only because there's a lot of people who are tempted that when they get good information, they can make better decisions. How much work can you do for the hardcore person? That's a trickier question, and a lot of them do never come out of it. But there are people who do. And one of the things that's important in that regard, by the way, and on this count, I'll recommend Mick West's book. I think it's called Down the Rabbit Hole. And he's a debunker who runs an internet internet debunking site. And he says, he tells a bunch of stories in that book of people who came out of the rabbit hole. There's various things that happen. Sometimes finally someone in the rabbit hole says something too crazy for them, and that sends them back up looking at the other things they believe. Big thing is he emphasized, be really patient, wait with people, give people the opportunity, don't back people into corners, don't attack them, their identity's on the line. A lot of people have invested personal identity in this. They've cut off friendships, they've cut off family. Sometimes their conspiracy groups in their social media are most of their social network. It's most of who they know and most of who they talk to. And so you're not just arguing someone out of an ideological opinion, you're arguing them out of a lifestyle, and you're arguing them out of a social circle. And so he says, like, patience and gentleness are really key. Then he says, I mean, keep making your case, but make your case in a way that it's really hard to like keep your composure, because sometimes it's infuriating. I mean, if someone you know is going to refuse a vaccine when they're a high risk individual for COVID, it's infuriating, right? If you're like, you're going to give my grandkid, you're putting my grandkids at risk of not having a grandparent when you probably had a good 10 or 15 years. That's infuriating, but playing that card, and I've played it, doesn't actually help.
Yeah, I think that's really wonderful advice, actually, this idea that you got to be patient. You got to kind of walk with people for the long term and slowly bring them out of this world. Because like you said, and like this author you quoted said, this is a culture, this is a sense of community that they have to remove themselves from slowly in order to get better. It's very hard to give those things up, and it's very hard to give up that worldview once it's got its grip on you. So I think that's wonderful advice.
And maybe I'll make a prediction as we wrap.
Sure.
Related to that. So I mean, the big one right now is the mRNA vaccines, right? And there's rampant conspiracy theories about them. And here's my prediction: those conspiracy theories have a shelf life. Because right now, there's people right now who I won't get them. I won't get the mRNA vaccine. Their spouse gets them, all their kids get them, all their neighbors get them, and everybody's fine. We're all right. You can read about crazy things on the internet, but at a certain point, you're fine. And my guess is 5 or 10 years from now, we're going to have 1 or 2 annual mRNA vaccines that are flu, cold, coronavirus. All these seasonal illnesses will be much reduced, almost gone in developed countries, because mRNA vaccines are really incredible when you start looking at the science. And the people who are against them now are going to forget how against them they were. They're going to retell the story. Oh, we just had some honest questions because it was new. And like all the really crazy stuff, no one's going to remember being on that side. And it's going to disappear because it can't be maintained in the face of the evidence. It's already overwhelming. The numbers going down are already pushing back against it. And the softer part, the softer part of the core is crumbling. The harder core is going to shrink, because you cannot maintain that mRNA vaccines are a genocidal intervention when at once they've saved millions of lives, including your own family.
Yeah, I think this is, the key, that in the end, the thing that will disprove a lot of this stuff is just our lived experience. So as time goes on, we're going to say that a lot of this stuff was just fake outrage or paranoia. It'll fade away over time. Let's just hope it happens sooner than later.
The sooner it happens, the sooner we can get past the restraints and the lockdown that the people who hate the vaccines hate.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Brett, for being on the show. It was fantastic talking to you. It was a really good conversation. Anyone who's interested in reading more or hearing more from Brett, Brett Salkeld has a Thinking Faith podcast. And you said you've got a lot of episodes already. And
it's got to be around 300 episodes. So
great.
What comes out every Tuesday morning, anywhere you get your podcast, look up Thinking Faith.
So people can binge on that if they want to.
You can spend a lot of time.
Yeah. And he also writes for Church Life Journal at times, and has a book out on transubstantiation. So once again, thank you so much for being on The Critical Catholic. I really appreciate it. And it was nice being with another Canadian, just us two, doing the Canadian thing here. So
good,
have a great night, eh? All right.
So good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, wonderful.